My aunt's smile didn't fade when the front door opened. It faded when she saw it was me standing in it. She had been laughing at something her husband said, leaning against the kitchen counter of the Lakehouse like she owned it, and I realized, with a coldness that settled in my chest, that she genuinely believed she did. I hadn't slept properly in 3 days. I'd driven 6 hours from Toronto through a snowstorm that turned the highway into a gray blur, stopping twice at Tim Hortons just to stay awake. My hands were still stiff from gripping the wheel. But none of that mattered once I saw my mother sitting at the dining table with her hands folded in her lap, looking like a woman who had been told to wait quietly in her own home. I set my keys down on the entry table, and the room went silent. My parents came to Canada from the Philippines in 1987 with 2 suitcases, a contact number for a distant cousin in Mississauga, and a plan they had made together over a kitchen table in Manila. My father worked construction for 11 years before he got his contractor's license. My mother cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week while putting herself through an accounting certificate at the local college. They were not people who asked for shortcuts. They were people who believed that if you worked hard enough and long enough, the ground beneath you would eventually become solid. I am their youngest daughter. I have one older sister, Tita Rosa, who is 15 years older than me and married a man named Dennis, who I will get to shortly. I am 31 years old. I work in residential real estate in Toronto, not selling houses, but financing them. I spent 4 years at Ryerson studying finance and another 3 years grinding through an entry-level position at a mortgage brokerage before I understood the business well enough to do something useful with what I knew. I don't say this to impress anyone. I say it because it matters to the story. 2 years ago, I started looking for a property for my parents. My father had just turned 69. My mother was 66. They were still living in the same semi-detached house in Brampton. They had bought in 1998 a house that had served them well, but that had stairs. My father was starting to struggle with neighbors closer than they liked, and a yard that had become more maintenance than joy. They had talked for years about retiring somewhere quieter, somewhere near water. My mother had a photograph on the fridge from a magazine of a lake at dusk with a dock and a row of birch trees. She'd had it there for so long the edges had curled. Their 50th wedding anniversary was in September of last year. I started looking in January. The property I found was on a lake about 40 minutes north of Barrie. It was a 3-bedroom bungalow, everything on one level, which mattered for my father's needs, with a wide covered deck, a private dock, mature trees along the property line, and a view of the water from the kitchen window. The previous owners had updated the plumbing and the electrical. The roof was 2 years old. There was a small detached garage for my father's tools and a garden patch along the south fence that I knew my mother would fill within 1 season. The asking price was $540. Ling, ling, ling. I got it for $512. Ling, ling, ling. I want to be clear about something. I did not have $512. 000 sitting in a savings account. I had been saving seriously for 6 years, living below my means in a way that my friends occasionally found depressing at dinner parties. I had 180 0 inches equity I had built through a small investment property. I sold the previous spring. I financed the rest through a lender I had worked with before, structured the mortgage carefully, and kept the monthly carrying cost within what I could manage, alongside my own rent in Toronto. It took me 4 months to arrange the financing and another 6 weeks to close. I had a real estate lawyer I trusted handle the title. I was meticulous about every document. The title was registered in my name and my parents' names, jointly, with a right of survivorship. I had a family law lawyer explain to both my parents exactly what that meant. My father read every page. My mother asked 3 questions. They both signed. I did not tell my sister. That was not an accident. My sister Rosa and I have never been close in the way people expect sisters to be. The age gap played a role. She was already in high school when I was born, already living her own life by the time I was forming mine. But it was more than that. Rosa had always had a particular relationship with the idea of what our parents owed her. She had been the first child, the one who had lived through the hardest years of my parents' early life in Canada, the one who had, as she often reminded us, sacrificed her own childhood to help the family survive. There was truth in that. I believed her. I also believed that she had used that truth as a kind of currency for 30 years, spending it on things that had nothing to do with what happened then. Her husband, Dennis, was, to put it plainly, a man who had never once looked at something that belonged to someone else without calculating whether he could get a piece of it. I had watched Dennis borrow money from my father 3 separate times and repay it 0 times. I had watched him suggest, casually at Christmas dinner, that our parents' house in Brampton would make a good investment property once they were ready to downsize, as if their house was an asset waiting to be harvested, rather than a home they had built their lives inside. I had watched my mother laugh it off and change the subject. And I had watched Dennis file it away. He was always filing things away. I kept the purchase quiet for 8 months. I told my parents in late August. A few weeks before the anniversary, my father sat at his kitchen table for a long time without speaking. My mother stood at the counter with her hand over her mouth. Then she walked to the fridge and took down the photograph, the one with the dock and the birch trees, the curled edges, and held it for a moment before she started to cry. That was the moment I had been working toward for 2 years. We planned to drive up together on the Saturday of their anniversary weekend. I had arranged for a few of their closest friends to meet us there, had organized flowers for the deck, had asked my father's best friend to bring his fishing rod. It was supposed to be the kind of day my parents could hold on to for the rest of their lives. On Thursday evening, 2 days before we were meant to go up, I got a call from my mother. She was whispering. She said that Rosa and Dennis had come by the house, that Dennis had somehow found out she didn't know how that there was a property in my name linked to my parents' address on some public registry. He had done some searching. He had found the listing photos from when the Lakehouse was sold. He had figured out enough. She said Dennis had been sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours, that he had a folder, that he was talking about family assets and equal inheritance, and something about how it wasn't legal for me to have put my parents' names on a deed without proper family consultation. I asked her where my father was. She said he was in the living room, that Rosa had told him to let Dennis handle it. I hung up and sat in my apartment for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Patricia, and she is very calm in the way that only people who have spent 20 years watching families fall apart over property can be. She told me what I already knew, which was that the title was clean, the documentation was sound, and that Dennis had no legal standing to challenge anything. She told me what I did not know, which was that he might try to apply pressure in other ways through family, through my parents' emotions, through the particular kind of manipulation that looks like concern. She told me to drive up to the property. I left Toronto at 5:30 in the morning. The drive north in November is not the same as the drive north in summer. The trees had lost most of their leaves. The lake, when I finally pulled down the gravel road toward the property, was the color of pewter under a flat sky. It should have felt bleak. It didn't. The birch trees along the property line had gone pale gold at the top, and the dock was still standing clean above the water, and there was smoke coming from the chimney. I had not started a fire in that chimney. My sister's SUV was in the driveway. There were lights on in every room. I sat in my car for a moment. I thought about the 11 minutes I had spent staring at the clock 2 nights before, and the 4 months of financing arrangements, and the 6 years of living below my means, and the photograph with the curled edges that my mother had kept on the fridge for as long as I could remember. Then I got out of the car. The front door was unlocked. I opened it and walked in. Dennis was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug that was not his, wearing a fleece vest like a man who had already decided the place suited him. Rosa was in the armchair by the window scrolling her phone. My mother was at the dining table with her hands in her lap. The way I described at the beginning, my father was not visible. I found out later he had gone to the garage, which is what my father does when he is distressed and does not want anyone to see it. My aunt and I want to be precise here, because precision matters. My Aunt Rosa looked up from her phone when I walked in, and the expression on her face shifted through 3 things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, recalculation, And then something that tried to arrange itself into authority. Dennis spoke first. He said my name. He said it the way he always says it, like a preamble to a negotiation. I did not respond to him. I looked at my mother and I said, "Are you okay?" She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I set my bag down on the table. I had printed everything before I left Toronto: the title deed, the mortgage documents, the joint tenancy agreement, Patricia's summary letter outlining the ownership structure in plain language. I had them in a folder. I put the folder on the table. Then I looked at Dennis, and I said, "What exactly are you doing in my parents' house?" He started talking. He talked for a while. He used words like family, and fairness, and legacy, and what our parents would have wanted. He suggested that I had acted unilaterally. He suggested that purchasing a property and placing my parents on the title without consulting the rest of the family was a form of financial manipulation. He suggested, and this was the part where I felt something go very still inside me, that our parents were elderly and perhaps had not fully understood what they had signed. My mother made a small sound. I opened the folder. I walked Dennis through every document. I did not raise my voice. I have spent years in rooms with lawyers and lenders, and I have learned that the quieter you are, the more space your words take up. I explained the title structure. I explained what joint tenancy with right of survivorship means. I explained that both of my parents had been represented by independent legal counsel before signing anything. I explained that Patricia's contact information was on the summary letter if he had further questions for her directly. Then I said, "There is nothing here for you." Dennis. He tried twice more. Rosa did not say anything during either attempt, which told me more about her than anything she might have said. The second time, Dennis tried something about speaking to their own lawyer. I simply waited for him to finish and then said that they were welcome to do that, and that Patricia would be happy to speak with whoever they retained, and that in the meantime I was going to ask them both to leave. Dennis put the coffee mug down. Rosa got up from the armchair. There was a moment at the door where my sister looked at me, and I looked at her. And I think we both understood something that we had been not saying to each other for most of our lives. She did not apologize. I did not expect her to, but her face, in that moment, was not angry. It was something closer to tired. I think she was tired of Dennis. I think she had been tired of Dennis for a long time and had simply made herself his partner in this because she didn't know how to be anything else at this point. I watched their SUV back out of the driveway. Then I went to the garage. My father was sitting on an overturned crate next to his toolbox, with his hands on his knees. He is not a man who cries easily in 69 years. I have seen it twice, both times at funerals, but his eyes, when he looked up at me, were red at the rims. He didn't say anything. I sat down on the cold concrete floor beside him, and we stayed like that for a few minutes without speaking. He said I should have handled it. I said you did. You went to the garage, so you didn't say something you'd regret. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I went back inside and found my mother still at the table. I made tea. I sat across from her. She told me that Dennis had shown up the day before, that he and Rosa had been at the property since Wednesday afternoon, had let themselves in using a key Rosa had found on my parents' keychain without asking. I filed that away for later. I told my mother what Patricia had told me, that everything was protected, that the title was sound, that there was nothing Dennis could actually do. She held her mug with both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the lake. She said, "I kept that picture for 22 years. I knew which picture she meant. I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't think it was something that could actually happen to us." I didn't say anything to that. I just sat with her. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store in Barrie and had 2 new sets of keys cut. I also bought new deadbolt locks for the front and back doors and spent an hour installing them, which my father supervised from a lawn chair on the deck with his coffee, occasionally offering observations about my technique that I chose to receive as affection. The next morning, their anniversary, I drove back down to Barrie and picked up a cheesecake from a bakery my mother had mentioned once, years ago, as making the best one she'd ever had. I don't know why that detail had stayed with me. It just had. When I put it on the counter, my mother laughed for the first time in 2 days. Their friends arrived at noon. My father's best friend did bring his fishing rod. Someone brought a portable speaker. Someone else brought a bottle of wine that was better than the occasion technically required. And we used it anyway. The deck, in November, was cold enough that everyone kept their jackets on. But nobody suggested going inside. My father stood at the railing looking at the water for a long time. I watched him from across the deck. Lauter. After everyone had gone, I sat on the dock alone while my parents read inside by the fire. I could see them through the window, my mother on the couch with her book, my father in the armchair with his lid up in the warmth of the room they had not known. 8 months ago would ever belong to them. I thought about Dennis and his folder. I thought about the 11 minutes watching the clock. I thought about the 6 years and the $180. 000, and the 4 months of documentation and Patricia's calm voice telling me to drive north. I thought about my mother holding that magazine photograph with the curled edges. A boundary is not a wall. It is not a punishment, and it is not a declaration of war. It is simply the place where you stand and say, this is what I built. And this is who I built it for. And that choice is not available for renegotiation. My parents called me the following week. My father wanted to talk about the dock. He had some ideas about adding a boat lift. Was already looking at prices. My mother asked about the cheesecake bakery. Whether I had the name written down somewhere? I had the name written down. I have not spoken to Dennis since he left the driveway that morning. Rosa called me once. About 3 weeks later, the call lasted 4 minutes. She did not apologize. She said that Dennis had some regrets about how he'd handled things. I said I was glad to hear that. She said she hoped we could move forward. I said I hope so too. We have not spoken since. I think about her sometimes not with anger, but with the particular kind of sadness that comes from watching someone capable of more consistently choose less. She is my sister. I will not close that door. But I am also done holding it open for people who have never once walked through it toward me. Love is not a blank check. It never was. And the sooner we stop writing it that way, the sooner we can figure out what it actually is. My parents are up at the lake right now. My father has been talking to the neighbors about an ice fishing setup for the winter. My mother has already planned what she is going to plant along the south fence in spring. She has a list. She sent it to me in a text with a flower emoji at the end. I have the photograph from the fridge now. She gave it to me before I drove back to Toronto. Said she didn't need it anymore. I keep it on my desk. The edges are still curled. It turns out, some things you imagine for long enough eventually become real. You just have to make sure, when they do, that the right people get to keep them.